Hello Fearless Gamers, Matt here for Fearless Games, and welcome to How to Play Battlefleet Gothic Remastered Part 4. Before we start this video, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. That way you know when more of these videos come out. Hit that little bell icon so YouTube actually tells you when these videos come out. And give this video a like. That way it gets out there and circulates more. And I can also see what content you guys really want to see. This helps me out greatly with deciding what kind of video content to give to you guys. And like I said, it helps out the channel a lot. And we really appreciate it if you could do that. So, with that out of the way, let's continue with the video. So far we've gone over what the game's about in basic principles, the movement phase, and the shooting phase. Now we're on to the ordnance phase. This is the phase where your ships that are armed with launch bays filled with attack craft and torpedo salvos are able to launch them out onto the field to either finish off enemy vessels or to help give you some more board control in later turns in the game. This is also one of the more unique turns because both players get to act in this phase. On your turn, you would move and do all of your ordnance attacks, and then your opponent gets to move and do all of their ordnance attacks. Then, on the opponent's turn, they get to move and do all of their ordnance attacks, and then you get to do yours, and so on and so forth. So this has the unique trait out of all of the phases where there's something where everybody is doing something almost every turn. So, without further ado, let's dive into the ordnance phase. So the first thing we're going to be discussing is launching your ordnance. This is done by declaring what type of ordnance your ships are going to be firing, placing the appropriate token down on the base during the shooting phase, and then in the ordnance phase, moving them in the appropriate manner that the rules apply to them. So this is one of those kind of dual phase things where part of it is done in one phase and the rest is done in another phase, which is also unique to the ordnance phase itself. So if you plan to shoot any torpedoes or plan to launch any attack craft, you have to declare it in your shooting phase, and then it does all of its movement in the ordnance phase. When you launch ordnance, that ordnance is no longer available until you perform the reload ordnance special order. However, this is only applied to the ordnance specifically that was launched. So, if you have a vessel that has torpedoes, fighters, and bombers, and you launch torpedoes in turn 1 and nothing else, your fighters and your bombers are available on turn 2, but not your torpedoes, until you reload ordnance. And the reload ordnance rule affects all of your ordnance. It's not one for each type. You reload it once, all of your ordnance comes back. And going off that, you're not allowed to store or save ordnance for later. So if you've got a strength 6 torpedo salvo on your vessel, you can't launch 3 in turn 1 and then have 3 available for turn 2. Same deal with bombers and fighters. You can't launch, say, 2 on turn 1 and then have 2 left over for turn 2. Once you've launched them, regardless of how many you have and regardless what your ship's limit is, once you use it, you can't use it again until the reload ordnance order is applied to the vessel. And in all cases, whether your ship has reloaded its ordnance or has never fired its ordnance, it's always considered to have it available when it wants to launch it. So if it's never fired its ordnance until turn 3, doesn't matter what happened between turn 1 and turn 3, they're allowed to fire it. If they reload their ordnance in turn 2, doesn't matter if they go under a different special order in turn 3 or turn 4, their ordnance is available to them. Unless there's some special rule or effect that is applied to the vessel that prevents it from using its ordnance. And also, the crippled status affects their ordnance as well. So if a ship gets crippled, the value of their ordnance is halved. And one last thing before we move on is there is a limit to the number of attack craft you can have on the field during any given turn. And that is based on the number of launch bays you have available throughout your whole fleet. So if you've compiled up a fleet and you have 2 ships that have 4 launch bays each, you can have a max of 4 attack craft on the field at any given time in any combination. So if you have 8, like I said, 8, you can have either 8 bombers or 8 fighters. You can have 4 fighters and 4 bombers. You can have 3 fighters and 5 bombers. It's not 8 and 8. It's whatever combination. You can only have 8 on the field at any given time. This rule doesn't apply to torpedoes. You can have as many torpedoes on the field as you want. This only specifically applies to attack craft. Now, there may be a scenario where you find a data rule sheet for a vessel in Battlefleet Gothic that never got updated to use the remastered rule set. And those ships are still compatible because the remastered rule set is basically the original rule set, just with some cleanup of the language and updated rules. And in those cases, though they might have a rule mentioned where they never run out of ordnance. This is tied to the reload special order. This is tied to the reload ordnance special order, where they had certain limits of. They had this clause in it where ships could run out of ordnance, and these vessels bypass that rule. That rule isn't in Remastered, so this gets translated to, if a ship has this rule, they double the number of ordnance they're allowed to have on the field at any given time. So if you happen to find some obscure ship that you really like that only has OG rules, and it has 4 launch bays, and it says it never runs out of ordnance, it's allowed to have 8 ordnance on the field at one time. That's the conversion for that. That's the only real conversion you're probably going to have to do in this game in terms of finding things that are compatible with the system that were never updated. And let's just say you are in that scenario where you've hit your ordnance limit, but you have so many fighters on the field and you don't need them, you need bombers on the field. You do have the ability to recall craft without expending them. You do this by announcing that you're going to be recalling the vessels, the attack craft, and immediately removing their tokens from the field to allow you to place down new tokens on your ship's stem that can then be fired, presuming that they have successfully reloaded their ordnance. However, these craft have to be removed immediately and not used in any way, shape, or form in the ordnance phase. This is to prevent you from using attack craft in the ordnance phase, recalling them, and then immediately dropping new attack craft that can then do whatever they want in that phase. So essentially, it's either you use it, and then you expend it, and then your next turn you have however spaces that you just expended available, or you immediately remove it so you can get new fresh ordnance that turn. But you can't recall units after they've already done whatever they're doing. Once ordnance has been launched, the first thing we do with them is we move them. Now, each ordnance that you should have a token that represents them. I'll put a link in the description to the original GW tokens. However, they're not the greatest because they're very generic and plain, making it tough to distinguish which token is supposed to be which type of ordnance, and also which one is yours and which one's your opponent. Thankfully, there are tons of files and options out there to get unique looking vessels that can represent a fighter, a bomber, an assault boat, and so on and so forth. So you do have options for that. So it's best to check which type of ordnance your fleet has available to it and make sure that you have tokens that represent each one to make it easy to see which ones are on the field and which ones aren't. Now, just like with regular attacks from a ship, when their ordnance is initially launched, you measure their movement from the stem of the ship that launched them out to whatever their max range is. The general rule of thumb is torpedoes is 30 centimeters, fighters are 30 centimeters, and bombers are 20 centimeters. There's going to be exceptions to that rule as with amongst different fleets, but that's the general gist, like you're going to be in those ranges. And any ordnance that was fired in a previous turn and is still remain on the field, you would just measure from where their starting point out to where they're going. And in cases of waves of attack crafts, which we'll get into a little later in this video, you need to place them side by side, stacking them out in like a line. You can't stack them on top of each other to make their profile smaller to avoid obstacles. They have to be all fanned out in a line. Again, we'll go over that later on in this video series. And when they move, just like other vessels, they're affected by blast markers. And they treat blast markers as if they're vessels without shields. So, if they move through a blast marker, you roll a d6, and on a roll of a 6, they are destroyed. Doesn't matter how many blast markers they go through, they only make this roll once. And this also applies if the vessel that they're launched from on the turn they're launched is touching a blast marker. So if they are launched and there's a blast marker touching their ship, they have to roll a d6 before they even get on the field. If the ship they're attacking has a blast marker touching any portion of its base, they have to roll this d6 to see if they get in. So this means that your ordnance could end up being destroyed before they get to go anywhere, or they could be destroyed before they get to attack their target. So keep that in mind when choosing your attacks for your ordnance. In the shooting phase, you're allowed to shoot at ordnance markers as if they were enemy vessels. Unlike shooting at enemy vessels, the target priority rule is slightly different. You don't need to roll a leadership check to ignore an ordnance marker if it's closer than the closest enemy vessel. And you don't need to roll a leadership check to ignore the closest enemy vessel to attack an ordnance marker. So you don't need to roll a leadership check if you have a vessel that's 10 centimeters away, but you want to shoot at a bomber squadron that's 20 centimeters away. Nor do you need to roll to attack a vessel that's 20 centimeters away if there's a bomber squadron that's 10 centimeters away. However, the target priority rule does apply between two ordnance markers. So, if there's an ordnance marker that's 10 centimeters away and you want to fire at one that's 20, you would need to roll a leadership check to ignore the closer ordnance marker. If you wish to split fire between two ordnance markers, you're going to need to roll a leadership check as well to do that. So, target priority applies when it's ordnance to ordnance, but not ordnance to enemy vessel. That's the best way to think about it. And when you shoot at ordnance with the weapon batteries on your vessels, you would use the ordnance column on the gunnery table, and then apply any modifiers that apply here. So range, blast markers, so on and so forth. In cases of weapon batteries and lance batteries, a roll of a 6 destroys one ordnance marker. Any ordnance markers that get caught in a Nova Cannon detonation are removed from play as well. When an ordnance marker comes in contact with the base of a ship or another ordnance marker, the effects of that ordnance are applied immediately. This includes any kind of movement done in the movement phase. So, this is where I was talking about board control earlier in the video. If a ship is moving and its path happens to cross over, say, a torpedo salvo marker or a bomber marker, then they immediately get attacked right there as if it was the ordnance phase. And unlike attacks from weapon batteries and lances and Nova cannons, the ordnance attacks ignore a ship's shields. So even if they have no blast markers touching them or no effect that disables their shields, the ordnance bypasses that and does direct damage. And ordnance must attack the first thing they come in contact with. There's no way to ignore that. However, they are allowed to go after any enemy vessel they want. They're not required to attack the closest enemy vessel. So, basically, if they come in contact with a ship or ordnance marker that they weren't intending to, there's no way for them to ignore it. They have to then apply their effects immediately. But in situations in, like, say there's a vessel that's 5 centimeters away, but the vessel they want to attack is 10 centimeters away, as long as the marker has enough movement to get around that other vessel, they aren't required to attack the closer one. They can ignore it to hit the one that's further away. And in situations where two ship bases of the same size are overlapping to a point where they occupy the same 2D space, the attacking player gets to decide which ship is being attacked. Now, as we said, ordnance attacks bypass a ship's shields, but that doesn't mean a ship is completely defenseless. This is where a ship's turret value comes into play. On a ship's datasheet, there's an entry for turrets, and the number in that box is how many d6 they get to roll in defense against ordnance attacks. So if you have a turret value of 2, you get 2 dice. Turret value of 3, 3 dice, and so on and so forth. And the way this works is, when a ordnance marker comes into contact with a ship's base, before their attack is applied, you get to take a dice pool equal to your turret value and roll it. Against torpedoes, any roll of a 4, 5, or 6 reduces the torpedo's salvo strength by 1. In terms of attack craft, every roll of a 4, 5, or 6 destroys one squadron. Now, in the midst of all this combat going on, it is possible for a turret's targeting systems to get overwhelmed and not be able to attack everything that comes at the vessel. To represent this, your turrets can only defend against one type of ordnance, either torpedo or attack craft. So if you get attacked by a salvo of torpedoes and you roll your turret defense against it, but then a wave of attack craft, being torpedo bombers, thunderhawks, bombers, what have you, comes in at you right afterwards, you're not allowed to use your turrets against them because you already chose to fire at the torpedoes instead. So it's very important when it's time to roll your turret defenses to really see what other kind of attacks your ship could incur, because you may accidentally use your turrets against the wrong type of ordnance and regret the decision you made. And there is one special rule involving turrets, and that's massing turrets. Massing turrets is when friendly vessels in base contact with an attacking craft get to contribute their turret's firepower to help defend the vessel. And the way this works is, for every vessel that is in base contact with the ship getting attacked, you get to add a +1 to their total turret value, up to a max of 3. Now, this turret bonus cannot be split against different ordnance types. So you can't go, I'll use my turret value for these torpedoes and use my mass turret bonus on the attack craft coming in afterwards. All of it goes into the one type of ordnance. This bonus does not apply when a ship is determining how much it reduces a bombing run's value. So when bombers do their attack runs, it only has to apply modifiers based on the ship's turret value. The bonuses for massing turrets don't apply. That'll make more sense when we get talking about bombers. And also, while a ship that masses turrets to help another vessel can also benefit from mass turrets on its turn if it happens to get attacked as well. The only vessels that cannot mass turrets are ones that have a turret value of 0 and ones that are crippled, but they can still benefit from massing turrets from other vessels. So in the case of a Eldar ship that has 0 turrets, or a drifting hulk that has no turrets, a ship that's in base contact with it can do mass turreting and apply a +1 bonus, giving it at least a minimum value of 1 against the ordnance attacks. And as we mentioned before, at any given time, only one ship can move at a time. So ships cannot benefit from mass turreting until the end of their movement or the beginning of their movement, never during the middle of their movement. This, however, does not affect the order or how ships that are protected under cap move their vessels. We'll get into that again later when we get into fighter craft. And in extremely rare scenarios, when a ship would come into contact with both a friendly ship and an ordnance marker at the same time during its move, that is the only time a vessel can mass turrets, when it's during the middle of a ship's movement. So in this example here, we've got a vessel that is flying past these turrets. It's just because it would make contact with the friendly vessel after this attack means it cannot gain the benefits of massing turrets just because, oh, they would be in contact with that ship after its movement. The only way they would be able to gain the mass turret benefit is if the scenario went like this, where the ship that's moving makes contact with both the friendly vessel and the ordnance marker at the same time. So now that we've gone over the ordnance phase and how we launch ordnance, how ordnance is moved, how enemy vessels can attack ordnance, what happens when ordnance makes contact with a target, and how vessels can defend against them with their turrets, we can now move on to all the different types of ordnance there are in the game. That is a pretty chunky bit of information, so to make these videos easier to upload and just so you're not sitting here watching a whole 50-minute video on just one phase, we're going to break it up into 2 different videos. So our next video is going to be going over the different types of ordnance in the game. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll take all those comments and questions and compile them up at the end of the series to do an FAQ, as well as any corrections for any mistakes I may have made in any of these videos prior to this. So, thank you all for watching, and until next time, fearless gamers, take care.